now I'm going to introduce Bruce Schofield. It's my pleasure to have Bruce with us here today. Bruce began studying astrology in 1967 and maintained a private practice as an astrological consultant, writer, and conference speaker for over 45 years. He has professional astrological certification from AFA and NCGR, is the author of 8 books and numerous articles on astrology, and has also written on other subjects, including science, archaeology, history, and hiking. Since 1979, he has served on the Education Committee of the National Council for Geocosmic Research. Most of you will know that as NCGR, as a member and director, and is currently president of the Professional Astrologers Alliance, which is the PAA, an astrological certifying body. It doesn't say so on his resume here, but he is also on the board of KeplerCollege, and we always appreciate that. He holds an MA in history and a PhD in geosciences, and has taught evolution and the science of Gaia at the University of Massachusetts and astrology and astronomy online for KeplerCollege. He lives in Amherst, Massachusetts. And you can find him at oneread.com and naturalastrology.com. So without further ado, I am going to pass the baton to Bruce, and we will get started with the webinar.
Okay, hi everybody. I teach a few courses at Kepler. There are online courses where you can take it at your own pace. One of them is astronomy. Another one is on, it's called Symmetry in Astrology, which is really about Uranian astrology. And the other one is on ancient Mesoamerican, that's Maya and Aztec astrology. Today I want to talk about a book that I wrote some years ago, and it was published, I guess, 2 years ago, called The Nature of Astrology. And it's a kind of a summation of the way I have come to think about astrology. You know, what it is, what are we doing with it? So it's more of a big picture, a broad perspective, as opposed to the usual kind of content in astrology, which is one technique or another. What I'm going to do in this talk is, once I go over some definitions that, and I'll give a little bio of myself first, I want to focus on some of the content in just one of the chapters of the book. I'll explain when I get there. Okay, here's the table of contents for The Nature of Astrology. And what I do is I break it into 3 parts, and each part has 4 or 5 chapters. Now, the book is designed so you can, it's really 3 books. So you can read, read part 1, part 2, or part 3 on its own. They stand on their own. And each chapter in the book also stands on its own. And I think this is a good thing because the book is very long, and I actually had to cut it down. The publisher didn't want to get too, it's 500 pages in all or more. And what I do is I start off with basically what's considered to be natural astrology. And now, the original definition of astrology from Ptolemy was genotheological astrology, which is about people, and general astrology or universal astrology called it, or natural astrology, which is about things like earthquakes and weather and, the floods and wars and the activities of groups of people like cities and states and countries and so on. And then this part 2, I spend a lot of time talking about and trying to answer the question, why did astrology get tossed into the closet? Because that's where it is, or it might be the attic or the basement as well, which is where I am right now. And it's a little cold down here, so. But we're not going to get disturbed. That's the good thing about where I'm located physically right now. In this section, part 2, though, I talk about how astrology lost its place in the culture. It was a subject that informed culture to a large extent. And, by the 18th century, it pretty much receded well into the background. And even though it's well known today, it's not well respected. And if you're a professional person and you wear your astrology badge, in a visible place, that could be professional suicide. I mean, that's the reality. And so astrologers have developed a kind of an outsider activity and continued to work on the subject itself. And I think that's a good thing. But the fact remains is that astrology lost a lot and is hardly back into a strong position. And so the third section, I talk about what I'm calling the viability of an astrological restoration. I'm trying to answer the question, is there a way that astrology can work itself back into culture and play a meaningful role? And I have a chapter here, chapter 13, Marginalized, where I get into the real nitty gritty about what the astrological world is like and what it might do to improve itself and so on. And that follows a couple chapters, one on testing astrology, the scientific evidence for it, and another one on theory, which I call mechanism or magic. Okay, so that gives you a background of the book and what I'm going to do today. I want to say a few things about myself as somebody in astrology for a long time. I got interested in 1967. I had a couple girlfriends in a row that were born on the same day, and my best friend in high school was born on that day. And I had another friend that was born the day after. And I couldn't miss this. What's going on? And I had a scientific background. I've always been interested in science. And I figured, well, the Earth is in the same part of its orbit every time that, at that time of year. And I picked up some astrology books from one of the girlfriends, actually had a couple of astrology books, and I got some information out of it. And it caught my attention. I'm a curious person to begin with and interested in all sorts of things, but this was amazing. So I dived into it, and within a couple of years, I was pretty knowledgeable of it. Back then, you had to calculate your own charts, and you had an ephemeris and a table of houses. And then after that, it was either using logarithms or trigonometry, or I started using a slide rule, actually, which was a tool that some people may not know what it is, but it's kind of like a ruler, and there's a ruler inside a ruler that slides, and you can do all sorts of calculations with it. Back in the 60s, all the engineers and science nerds used to carry them around. They used to have like slide rule pouches that they would attach, or like a sheath they would put on their belt like it was a knife. And that was always pretty funny. But the slide rule allowed me to calculate the charts. And then some years later came in the calculators, the hand calculators. And that was kind of a major, major change and development in astrology, because you could really knock off some charts pretty quickly with, once you got used to the calculator. And then they got programmable. And then in the late 70s, personal computers came out. And I picked one up. I think I paid like $1,400 for it, 1977 or 78. And it had a little tiny screen, maybe the size of a postcard almost, and it took floppy disks. But there was software available. The company Astrolabe today was Astrographics back then, and then there was Matrix, Michael Erlewine's company, and they had software out very early. So that was a wonderful thing, and you could get your charts done, almost instantly, and get a dot matrix printer and print them out. In any case, so I kind of came through this period where astrology went from being highly dependent on the ability to calculate a chart to it being not a problem to get a chart. And so there was more time to spend on testing out techniques and learning how astrology worked. Along the way, I learned quite a few things. I early on got interested in Uranian astrology. I had friends. I grew up in New Jersey, and New York wasn't too far away. And Gary Kristen and I had gone to Rutgers together in college. We met there, and he had some contacts in New York and Uranian astrology contacts, and I was involved with that. So I learned that early on. And I was very interested in the history of astrology. And back then, the only ancient books on astrology available were Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos and Manilius, which had been translated. And also around that time was Dorotheus, I think, but there wasn't much else. And you couldn't take it very far. It wasn't until the late 90s when we were really able to take a good look at what Hellenistic and Roman astrology was like. So I've been through a lot of trends in astrology, and I made a living reading charts, for about 45 years. And it was, pretty much my main income. And I used to do about 4 readings a day during the week, had an office on the side of my house. And then in, the last 20 years, I've slowed down. Right now, I'm not doing any readings at all, but I got more into teaching, and I had a master's in history, and I got a PhD, and taught at the University of Massachusetts for about 15 years. And that was a good experience. But nobody there had any idea what I was doing in astrology. And that in itself was very interesting. Although occasionally somebody would mention that they had an interest in it, but they didn't want to talk about it. Okay, so enough of my background. And let's see if I can move ahead in the slides. What do I have to do here? That worked. Okay. I want to say a few things just in general that I think are very important for people to keep in mind and to think about and maybe expand on. We have to ask ourselves, if we're in astrology, what kind of a subject is it? When I came up in astrology from the 60s and 70s, there was this constant back and forth. Is astrology a science? Is it an art? What is it? Is it divination? Is the historians would say it's a historical artifact. And then the other big question is, how does it work? How do we get these results? Are there causal connections? Is it magic? There are things about astrology that are very scientific, like the idea of aspects. They're very precise mathematically, and the timing of events, are pretty accurate, events correlating. But there are other things about it that are very strange and mysterious, like how does a single planet describe a specific, realm of information? What's that all about? Is there a cause, or is astrology working by synchronicity? Nobody knows right now, but I don't think there's any reason to toss out the idea that there are causal connections, and there might be resonance, and there might be some biological basis to astrology. One of the things I like to point out is that when you get locked into this idea that you have to have an explanation for everything that we come across in astrology in order to feel secure about the subject, I think you're making. I think that's a mistake. I think that's a flawed direction to go in. I think that the approach to take, and this is what just about every other subject takes, is to work on bits and pieces of it and see what you can come up with. Astrology does seem to be a lot more complex than most other subjects. And so it does make a lot of sense to focus on a few things at a time. It might be a good idea to show how Mars and Venus actually work, and maybe there are some causal connections. Maybe there is some kind of resonance. rather than to spend a lot of time trying to prove that hypothetical planets work. And I'm not saying that they do or they don't. I'm just saying that in attacking the question, how does astrology work, I think it's going to be a lot smarter to attack pieces of it rather than the whole thing. There's a lot to consider. You know, we live in electrical fields all around us. The positions of the planets in the solar systems cause changes in the sun. They cause changes in the configuration of the Earth's magnetic field. All our cells are running off electricity in various ways. The transport of electrons in photosynthesis, a really basic thing, just shows how electrical the world is, the biosphere. But I'm not going to go down that road. I talk more about that in the first part of the book, in the first section. All I'm saying is that there may be some very solid biological explanations for parts of astrology that we should not ignore. And I think it's a mistake to just throw up our hands and say astrology is divination, because that doesn't explain anything really. And it certainly doesn't go over well in the rest of the world. I mean, why do we want to participate with the rest of the world? Well, I think it's a good idea that we find a way to communicate with the rest of the world, because I think astrology has something to offer. It's not about conforming to some kind of standards, although, I mean, I think there are very reasonable standards, in communication that need to be established and understood. But I think astrology would be a lot better off if it was able to operate coherently along with other subjects in the rest of the culture. Okay, so I have a proposed definition of astrology, and this is another thing that I spend a lot of time in the book on. I'm not going to go into it in any depth today, but I just want to put it out there. My definition of astrology is that it is the subject that develops and explores mapping techniques, and I would add timing techniques, for the analysis of complex self-organizing systems that display correlations with the natural geocosmic and astronomical periodicities of the temporal environment. A lot of big words. Complex self-organizing systems. I just want to say that the subject matter of astrology is self-organizing systems and nothing else. Now, self-organizing system is something like a cell, or an organ, or a body, or the mind, or the identity that evolves, that develops out of an active brain. There's a community of communications that takes place. For example, the stock market. And we all know, or at least most of us know, that we should know by now, that the stock market certainly does follow astrological configurations. So it's a self-organizing system. And so is, a nation or a city. And so is the weather system and the climate system. And these things all respond to planetary positions. They're all a part of astrology traditionally. That's what a self-organizing system is. And living things are self-organizing systems. They're composed of many elements that have many internal feedback loops that build on themselves. And the next thing you know, they're alive. They're self-sustaining. You can have a baseball team, be a self-sustaining organizing system. Another interesting is take a country, a nation state. Yeah, it was formed by certain people, and their personalities may have imprinted its identity, but they're long since gone, and yet the identity is sustained. How is it sustained? But it does seem to be that way. And I think that's when you study self-organizing systems, you learn that. Now, so the general category, self-organizing systems, it's part of what's called systems science. And systems science also includes as subsets other areas, related areas that have names that kind of overlap with each other, like complexity and chaos. And fractals are involved in that as well. So it's good to think in terms of system science as a way of studying self-organizing systems. And then the natural, geocosmic, and astronomical periodicities of the temporal environment, time environment. One of the things I have spent a lot of time thinking about is evolution. And we know about evolution from Darwin and other people since then as adaptation to the environments that we as organisms move through. And, animals have changed over time. We know that from the fossil record. What I think astrology brings into the picture is this idea of a temporal environment, a time environment. And we're evolving in that as well, but it's just not as obvious. And it is a fact that all kinds of planetary movements are reflected in, planetary movements create time divisions in our environment, in our time environment. And it is known that organisms, biological organisms, react to them. I mean, we have daily rhythms and lunar rhythms, and we have rhythms of shifts and changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit that are driven by planets, and they correlate with ice ages. There's a large body of information that shows that things that are going on Earth are reacting to the solar system. And you find them in biology, you find them in, climate, paleoclimatology, the history of climate. It's out there. It's considered mainstream science, but looks to me like astrology. So that's my definition, something to think about. I've done whole talks just on this itself. One of my thoughts is that we need to start thinking of astrology as a subject. Now, take, psychology, for example. Psychology has theory, it has research, and it has a practice. And I think the same thing can be said for a lot of other subjects, medicine in particular. But astrology as a subject could be organized this way. This would be my proposal, that you have a history, and I think astrology is doing very well in history. We have some very good historians, and we are, starting to really, map out how astrology developed, from early times to modern times. Then there's theory. I mean, this is something that is not really very developed in astrology. There are many proposals. Almost everything that's out there is a hypothesis. If you ask the average astrologer, how does astrology work, they either won't know, or they'll say synchronicity, or they'll say maybe, refer to quantum mechanics and non-locality. But nobody really understands that. Nobody really is able to put that into some form that makes sense in the context of what we know about astrology. So I think theory is something that's been developed to some degree in astrology, but not much. And there's no all-encompassing theory at this point. There are just hypotheses. Now, in order to get to a theory, you have to have research. And there is some in astrology. There's, of course, the Gauquelin studies, which are just amazing, and other studies as well. And there are efforts in astrology to encourage research and peer-reviewed publications and so on. So that's very important. And then there's the philosophy of astrology and spirituality. That's a good topic. And I think there is a lot of material scattered around the field of astrology that could fall into that category. I put here Stoicism as a foundation. I really think that the Stoics were, in the ancient world, were the ones that had the best grasp of what astrology was and how it might be used as a way to live. And then there's practice, and that's what 99% of people in astrology do. So, practice is not a science. So the answer to the question, is astrology a science or an art or a craft? It's pretty simple, I think. When it's a practice, it's a practice. It's not a science. It's a skill set that you learn. You test out these different things, you try these different techniques. Today with the computers, we have all sorts of things we can test out. But it's not a science. You're not doing science. You can take ideas from practice and test them out, and then you would move it into the category of research. And then you've got to apply methodologies, and you have to know what you're doing. And with astrology, because we're dealing mostly with correlations, you have to know your statistics. The causal connections between the planets and what we experience in astrology are not known. Except with the exception of some of the solar rhythms and the lunar rhythms, and those are mostly gravity and magnetic fields. So this I think is a very important point. Recognize that practice is not a science. Practice it's like psychotherapy in psychology. The average psychotherapist is not out doing research. You have people doing psychological research at the universities, and they're funded for it. And that's one of the real challenges for astrology, is that it's a subject that has been pushed into the corner in the culture, and it has no really strong institutions to support the pathway towards being a well-rounded subject, with these proposed categories that I have here. And so it remains a practice, and I would add a mostly unregulated practice. I mean, the good thing that's happening is schools like Kepler and certifications that some of the organizations, have offered, are starting to bring more of a focus into the field and bring it closer to what would be expected in any other subjects. But astrology has been a free-for-all for a long time, and what happens? Well, okay, I'm gonna go on to the next category here. This is chapter 13 of my book. A lot of these issues are I discuss there, and it's basically a look at what are some of the problems astrology faces. And I have here that it's completely rejected as a serious subject by the well-educated. And I think that KeplerCollege is a good example of that. At the beginning, KeplerCollege was actually accredited in the state of Washington. But that didn't go over very well with certain people who were in academia, and it got de-accredited. And it basically is registered as a kind of a trade school. And which is appropriate as a practice. But when Kepler started, it really had a big emphasis on history, and it was starting to be presented as a subject. And part of the reason is that there's a chaotic representation of astrology to the public. If there's an astrological question that somebody in the news, some news organization wants to look into, like, are there 13 signs, for example? That pops up every few years. Who do they go to? They don't know who to go to. So what happens in astrology is that you have some people that are able to promote themselves better, or some people that are connected, they know somebody that knows somebody, and then they represent the entire field of astrology to the public. That could be good. Most of the time, I don't think it's so good. Then there are the failed public predictions. This is uncontrolled. People make predictions and hope that it boosts their profile, gets them more clients or, more publicity, whatever. There's a lot of failed predictions. The last election, I think about 2/3 of astrologers, were wrong on the election. And there are a lot of problems there. I'm not saying that they should be right or they should be wrong, but I think there needs to be a kind of the field needs to be better organized about these things and control some of these things, or at least set up some kind of panels that regulate them a little bit, because no other field does that. It's it doesn't look good, when a lot of astrologers make a prediction and it fails. It's better to keep your mouth shut, I think, if you're not sure. And so as a result, astrology is not able to contribute to the general knowledge. And I think this is very unfortunate. I think astrology has a lot to contribute to the general knowledge, but it's not getting it across for some of these reasons, and some that I'll go into. Again, why is astrology rejected? And this I'm turning a little bit to the second part of my book, in part here. There was an event in the 1970s that actually affected astrology in a very profound way. Astrology was starting to get a little bit more scientific in the 70s, and Michel Gauquelin and his studies were getting to be known. There were people around the world that were, trying to bring astrology more into, more as a sophisticated subject with a research program. And the reaction to that was, severe. The American Humanistic Society devoted an entire issue to attacking astrology somewhere in the mid-70s. Objections to astrology, and they had 100 and some Nobel Prize winners. No, they had I guess about 20 Nobel Prize winners and about 100 and some scientists sign a petition saying that astrology was just nothing but bunk. I don't know if they used that word, but that it was nonsense. And they published it all over the place. And there were articles in that journal that where they criticized Gauquelin's work. And there's a whole story about that, how the critics, the skeptics, turned on Gauquelin's work and tried to replicate it improperly, and then, of course, found that it didn't work, that the studies failed, and then they promoted those publicly as much as possible. And it's an incredible story that I won't get into, because there were some defectors, and there's a good book on it, called the it's about the Mars effect, the tenacious Mars effect, worth reading. Another problem with astrology is that the perception of determinism is baked in. People just don't like the idea. I have a friend who's an retired astrophysicist who, he just goes bonkers when astrology comes up, and I can make his head spin in a minute with some of the things I have to say. Like the other day, I told him, that one of the values of astrology is it actually makes you less determined, so that people that don't know anything about astrology could be said to be more determined in their behavior than those who know something about it. And that flipped him out. But I think that's true. I think that when you do astrology personally and for your clients, you're providing information that you can use to modify your behavior, or at the very least to understand what you're passing through. Now, that being said, the problem of determinism is a big one, because it's right at the core of religion. If you don't have free choice, then people aren't guilty of doing things like eating an apple in the Garden of Eden. Uh, Anybody that wants to dive into it, I'm sure we'll find lots of information on it. But the existence of free will is vital, particularly for Christianity and Islam as well. Uh, and it's also baked into liberal culture. The blank slate, this is an idea uh, that goes back to the 18th century and the philosopher John Locke. And he talked about people being born pretty much as a blank slate, and that their environment shapes them. And this is something that was picked up by a lot of people, and it's at the basis of behavioral psychology. It's the basis of most of the educational thinking in our culture. But it doesn't seem to be true. I mean, the more you learn about genetics, and you look at twin studies, for example, you begin to find out that we're not really blank slates. We have something that's steering us in certain directions that make us, individuals, and that our environment doesn't really have that much of an effect. I mean, you can take, identical twins and separate them and put them in two different environments, separate them when they're young, and they'll come up still very similar. I think this fear of not being equal is at the base of it, and the some of the thinking that became part of, say, the Declaration of Independence and some of the documents that Jefferson in particular was involved with are sometimes misinterpreted. I think Jefferson was pretty smart, and he didn't think that people were all equal, but he thought they should be treated as equals. And there's a lot of complexity in there in regard to equality and the role the blank slate plays in the choices that our government makes about things, which we're seeing a big change right now. Okay, I'm not going to go into politics. And the idea that astrological fate implies an all or none choice. I mean, couldn't it be possible that astrological fate, whatever that is, we'd have to define that first, could apply to us more in some cases and less in others? It doesn't have to be all or none, right? But I think there's a perception that it has. As soon as you bring up astrology and you bring up fate, people go into a panic. And then it gets even stranger when you bring in behavioral genetics. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Robert Sapolsky. I heard him speak one time at the university here, and I recently read his book last year, I guess, called Determined. You read that, and it makes astrology look lightweight. So there's a conflict going on in our culture now about determinism, individual determinism, and this blank slate idea that we're all being equal and that the environment is the most important factor in how we become who we are. And I also mentioned here the Stoic viewpoint. The Stoics thought there was a thing they called causal determinism, that we were kind of determined by our personalities, and they weren't really changed very much by our environment and by our parents. We were a product of our parents. We had their genetics, but our character is there almost at birth. And then what happens is, because we incline a certain way because of who we are, our choices are consistent, and so that we seem to be determined. And to the Stoics, the location of free will was in your thinking about yourself and your understanding about it. And that in most cases, when confronted with a choice, you would tend to choose the path that best represents who you really are, your basic identity. So from the outside, it looks like you're still, causally determined. But on the inside, you're very aware of what you're doing.
We have a question, Bruce.
Yeah, good.
And I just want to remind everyone that that if you have questions for Bruce, to put them in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. But the question is that this theory conflicts with epigenetics. Can you explain your rationale and theory?
What conflicts with epigenetics?
This is the entire question. This theory of determinism, I suppose.
Well, epigenetics, is, the realization that there are stretches of DNA with genes that are not being used, but can be called into action. And it doesn't really cancel out natural selection. It's part of that process. It's just another detail. I'm not saying that we're determined. What I'm saying is that the culture is so rooted in this idea of a blank slate and people having free will that astrology, causes, a mental disturbance, when it's confronted. And, people don't want to know about it. They just don't want to go down that road. And at the present time, neuroscience and genetics and evolutionary psychology and subjects along those lines are looking at this in a very different way. And astrology is outside of those, looking, with its own position. I think actually filling in a very important part of the picture. But because astrology does not contribute to the culture, because it's not taken seriously, that, the astrology voice is not being heard. And I would also add that the astrology voice needs to be a little more sophisticated in order to be heard. And that's coming along. There are some very good people in astrology that are doing some very, very good thinking about it. But epigenetics, I'm not sure, what the question is. I'm certainly not, saying that things are completely determined by the one set of genes that we have. Life on this planet is extremely adaptable. And there's a lot going on in genetics now that show it's a lot more complex than we ever thought it was.
Thank
All
you.
right, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
Another problem that we have is that the symbolic language of astrology is incomprehensible to outsiders. And boy, is that true. You can't use these words around people. When I'm around people that are very well educated, they can't get it. They just don't understand symbolic thinking. And I like languages in general. I think that the younger you are when you get into astrology, the better off you're going to be. I got into it when I was about 18, and I picked up on it. And I think in astrology, as I assume most of you do. And you see something and you say, "Oh, that's Mars." But most people won't get that at all. And I think that people that are in philosophy or in physics are particularly resistant to thinking along those lines. They just can't understand that at all, how that's done. And, so that's a problem. How do you communicate? How does the field of astrology communicate with the rest of the world when its language is incomprehensible? So, this is going to take some work. And I think the first thing is to have a body of knowledge developed that explains astrological symbolism and where it may come from, and an explanation that it's not just mythological or social science based. It's got to be based in the mind, some some neuroscience, brain science needs to be involved here as well. And then there are the public assumptions about astrology. So it's labeled a New Age subject. So if you go to the store, the bookstore, there's New Age, and there's tarot cards and magic and runes and self-help books. And there's, poor old astrology usually on the lowest shelf. I have to tell you, in the late 60s and early 70s, astrology was not on the lowest shelf in the occult bookstores. That's what they were called then, occult bookstores. They were, well placed and respected. But they've kind of, they don't sell as well because astrology is hard. It's not easy to learn. But because it's labeled a New Age subject, it comes with that New Age subject. It comes with that baggage, that it's it's some kind of self-help thing, which it's not. Astrology, there's no comparison of astrology with some of these other subjects. Astrology is, yeah, it's got the symbolism, but it's got a lot more going on in addition to its history. I think it's a major subject, really, like right up there with the other major subjects that are taught in universities. So astrology is assumed to be a pseudoscience. When I was a kid, that's what I heard, pseudoscience. I was a little kid, and I was interested in astronomy, and I had a book on the stars, and the first thing it said was astrology was a pseudoscience, a pretend science. Yeah. But as a practice, it is. It's not the practice of astrology is not a science. And if you call it a science, then it is a pseudoscience. So I think it's very important to say what it is. What you're doing. When you're researching astrology, okay, you're doing science. You're taking it apart. You're doing a study. But when you're practicing it, and you're looking at somebody's chart, and you're saying, what does this Mars-Neptune thing mean? And how's it going to be expressed in their chart? And what happens when Saturn comes by? That's a synthesis of information. And it's not a science. It's really much more like an art. It's like an improvisation. If you play music and you're good at it, you know your scales, your notes. That would be the equivalent to knowing your planets. And then you put together a solo, that would be equivalent to doing an interpretation. So it's not a science. That's why you don't see many scientists in jazz bands. So, they might be composing some music or something, some, sound, product. But so astrology, the last line here, astrology does not seem to have rails and is perceived as out of control. I think that's very true. It's perceived as kind of messed up. It's not in one place. You can't put your finger on it. There's just a few personalities that emerge out of the vast number of people that know astrology. And part of it is that everyone that astrology is so isolated and pushed to the corner that everyone that studies it calls themselves an astrologer, pretty much. So the rest of the world doesn't know who's who, doesn't know how to separate one person from another. They're just all astrologers. There's this science issue here. I have a few more things to say. Is the practice of medicine a science, and are psychotherapists doing science? I mentioned that before. And I think the answer is no. And I think that the problems with doing astrological research is that people that are practitioners and very good at it may not necessarily be very good at doing science, because science is meticulous and draws boundaries everywhere, whereas doing a practice is seeing connections. And so the problem with astrology is there's a lack of qualified researchers, and the subject matter is unbelievably complex. And the best you can do is, in most cases, is find a correlation. In fact, the best journal on astrology, in my opinion, is Correlation out of England, and that makes a lot of sense. It's basically that's what you're finding when you try to do scientific research in astrology. You find correlations. The lack of a causal mechanism is a huge problem. And like I said before, I'm not saying that everything in astrology is running off causal mechanisms. We don't know how astrology works, but some of it does have causes. The lunar cycles found in marine organisms, for example, or lunar cycles found in people, and there's plenty of them. You can go online and look up moon research, and there's lots of it. Hospital records have been looked at, and things have been shown, like more births at the full moon, so on. And there's a causal mechanism there. Maybe for the most part, it's probably gravity, but it still needs more work. It needs to be fleshed out. So that's a big problem in astrology. The causes of the astrological effect is just an immense problem that's going to take decades. And then there's the idea of, within the field itself, just testing things, like testing astrology on non-human subjects. Like, for example, we do astrology on people. Most of the field of astrology, people in the field of astrology, are working on charts of individual people. And so they tend to be a bit anthropocentric. But what about your dogs or cats? I mean, do they have charts? I had a dog, and I knew that I got the chart because the people told me what time she was born. And the dog responded to astrology. And I've seen it with other pets as well. But to the same extent as people, not quite. It was a little fuzzy. So, this is just, a preliminary observation. This is something that should be tested and studied. What are the limits? And this house system business, I mean, there's 20, 30 house systems, and some of them are elegant. If you're a mathematician, your favorite house system might be the one that's the most complicated, or the most beautiful, or, mathematically elegant. If you're somebody like me, I was looking for one that was easy to calculate and worked. And back in the 70s, I was testing out house systems, and everybody had Placidus because it was available. I mean, there was Dalton's Table of Houses. Everybody had it. So they were using Placidus houses. And the crazy thing is that the guy, Dalton, that wrote this introduction trying to explain Placidus houses in the introduction to that ephemera, Table of Houses, and he's wrong. It's like the wrong explanation. Anyway, so I tried a few others, and I came across Porphyry, which is a trisection of the arcs between the ascendant and midheaven. And I watched the transits to the cusp, and worked pretty good. Placidus worked okay. Coke worked okay. Meridian houses worked okay. Some of the other ones, like Campanus and Regiomontanus, the house cusp didn't work at all, to my satisfaction. So I wound up using Porphyry. I still use it. Easy to calculate, simple. It's just ecliptic based. It's not particularly elegant, but practical. I'm not saying that everybody should do that. What I'm saying is that this is an area in astrology that's kind of crazy. people don't really know why they use what house systems, and we have to decide whether, in order to evaluate a house system, is it whether the planet is in the house, how far away is it from the cusp, or are we looking at the cusps? I think the easiest way to test house systems is to see if the cusp is an active, sensitive point. But a lot of people don't think that way. They just, that the planet is in the house and that's it. Well, the truth is that we just don't know about this stuff. You can learn a lot about the house systems. I wrote a book called Astrological Chart Calculations, and I have a whole big section on house systems. And, you can look at them and you can learn about them, but we really don't know how they work. Maybe some person's opinion carries some weight because they're successful. I don't know. And then the zodiacs, boy, what a problem that is. Sidereal versus tropical. And, there's a tendency among astrologers to be very tolerant of different opinions. And that's a good thing to have when you're a kind of alienated group. A group that's not part of the mainstream and needs to do what it can do to hang together. But it seems to me that, this needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. What is really working? I mean, we can't have people having, being born in the sign tropical Cancer and, in sidereal Gemini, and then have the same description for themselves. I think somebody from the outside looking at astrology and seeing anything like that, their head, they would just walk away because it's ridiculous. And that's a whole topic in itself, and that's a huge problem. Precession is related to it, and twins are a really good subject that astrology should pay more attention to. But you got to get the data. And the University of Minnesota has a long study on twins. And someday, somebody with a lot of astrological knowledge might get a hold of that data set and do something with it. But so far, that hasn't happened to my knowledge. So here are even more problems. The lack of boundaries in astrology projects chaos and favors the best hustlers. Now, what we've got going on in astrology is a subject where it's a free-for-all, as I said before, and is being held together by institutions like KeplerCollege and certification boards and things like that, but they're not terribly dominant in the field. So you still have the need, to make a living if you want to do astrology. I liked astrology so much that I wanted to make a living at it. So I had to figure out how to do that. And that was pre-internet. So I did it by, business cards and a newsletter and writing some articles and books and promoting myself the best I could. And I'm not a person that likes to promote things. I have Mars in Libra, so I don't like to hit people over the head, except maybe in terms of ideas. But I managed and I made a living at it. But today it's very competitive, and you have to have your website and your social media presence, and you got to shout loud and you got to make yourself known. And this is actually taught. You can get, Kepler offers courses on how to make a living as an astrologer, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's how chiropractic is another interesting subject that is worth looking at to when you want to think about astrology's predicament, because chiropractic was kind of on the outs. And what they did was they learned how to promote themselves. Numerous courses were available to people going through the program on how to start your business and run it and so on. I think that's good. I think, that people, need to promote themselves and need to go, set up their own business at a time when there's no institution or other options. I mean, you can't you can't look up in want ads and find a job for an astrologer. You have to be self-employed, which, by the way, people that are self-employed have a very strong sense of self. And so they tend to have very strong opinions about things. And that affects the whole group at large. And, so again, it's like a bit of a free for all, and certain more dominant characters will rise to the top. And, some are very successful in hustling. And we live in a hustling culture. In the United States, the corporate capitalism and hustling are really the core elements of the American dream. I don't think the founders of the country thought that. I don't think they thought it would go that far. But anyway, in regard to astrology, I think what's going on is that you wind up with the most successful hustlers getting the most attention, and eventually this will lead to corporate exploitation of the field. If astrologers get successful enough, that's going to be perceived as money for somebody. Other people will perceive it as money, and they'll be exploited. Just like a talented musician gets, signs a contract with a manager and gets him a record contract, and then that person winds up getting 75% of the royalties. It's as soon as astrology begins to be perceived as a money-making thing, which may be demonstrated by successful hustling astrologers, that will become a point where astrology begins to be manipulated by the corporate, world in some ways. Now, another thing is that artificial intelligence, I think, is going to wind up replacing many astrologers. I think I say here, it'll clean out amateurs and low-level hustlers. Well, maybe. I've gone on, ChatGPT and Gemini and a few others, asked for astrology readings. They're not bad, and they're going to get better. So what are we going to do about that? So I think astrology really needs to find its place in the world of knowledge. And I think that place is somewhere between the social sciences and the humanities, and maybe a little bit towards biology and neurobiology. I think that there's a place for astrology. It's certainly not going to be in with the hard sciences, and it's not just a humanities subject like art. Not that there's anything wrong with art, but art is, it's a thing. It's craft. It's a kind of communication. But I think somewhere around psychology, maybe might be the place where astrology can become established as a subject. So this is the dilemma. The tendency of astrologers to use one world view as a way to organize the subject. Well, yeah, I think these days it's mostly kind of a worldview that's not articulated well. It's not fleshed out. As I said earlier, the field of astrology is not in any way developing a coherent theory because it can't, because it has the research is not deep enough. Astrology does appear to work on many levels, and as I mentioned earlier, it is consistent with mathematical principles. So maybe there is a way, there's some way that the consistencies built into astrology could be organized and become part of the definition and be presented to the world in a way where it can be thought about critically. So this goes back to what was saying right at the beginning, that astrology needs to be thought of as a subject and it needs to be well defined. I offered a proposed definition that, in order to fully understand, would require some understanding of system science and what a self-organizing system is. But a community-wide agreement on what astrology is not with us at the present time. We don't really have that. We have general ideas that are not refined, and since that's the case, the field of astrology cannot present itself to the world with one face, and so it remains, pretty much a free-for-all, with some very good things happening with organizations and schools, but there are many other people that are doing whatever they want to do on their own. Okay, I've presented pretty much what I wanted to present, and I don't think I should go any further. I'd like to open it up for questions and see what you thought of what I had to say.
We do have a question here. What are your thoughts about Richard Tarnas's explanation of why astrology works? I'm sure you're familiar, but there's a quote from him: "The universe is informed and pervaded by a fundamental holistic patterning, which extends through every level, so that a constant synchronicity or meaningful correlation exists between astronomical events and human events."
Yeah, that's probably from his, Cosmos book there. And yeah, I mean, I'm not that could very well be. I mean, that's a view. Archetypal astrology might be the a name for that, or at least part of that view, and it brings in a lot of ideas, but it's a theory that hasn't been tested. The evidence for it is not laid out in any clear and organized way. I'm not going to say he's wrong. I mean, I have my ideas too, but what I'm saying is that we're not really in a position to, say with certainty that this is how it is, because if we, took that statement and walked out into the rest of the world and said this is what we believe, I don't think it would take us too far just yet. There are some things, synchronicity, for example, is, often cited as an explanation for astrology, and Jung was the one that came up with that idea. But at the end of his life, Jung didn't think it was that good of an idea for a number of reasons. So, I mean, I think people should be thinking about this, and I think that, what Rick Tarnas says is, I think it offers a way of looking at the universe in a system sense as interconnected. And I'm all for that. What I'm saying is that these ideas are not fully fleshed out yet. And we have to recognize that. In other words, we're going down the right track, but we got, another 100 miles to go.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Another question here: why do you think that there isn't more research in astrology? Is this just a lack of funding?
Well, definitely lack of funding. I mean, to do, even a crappy study in science, you need a lot of money. And when I was working at the University of Massachusetts, there was a room that held some scientific instruments that were very expensive, that measured the age of, certain isotopes and so on. And the cost to maintain that device, I used to joke around and say that the cost for 1 week for that one device in that one room, in that one department, in that one university, was way more than all the money that went to astrology for research in that year. Yeah, so there's not any money for it. I mean, I've done research projects, but maybe I got a little bit. I think I wrote a paper for the AFA once in their research journal, and I think they paid me $100 or something.
Yeah.
So, and it took me 2 weeks of to 80 hours to do it. So yeah, it's just not practical. And so we don't have the people that are qualified to do it. Very few. Some are.
Yeah.
But you get distracted by the need to learn, the desire to learn more, and the need to develop your skills so that you can actually practice the subject. Mm-hmm. It's a circular situation right now that it's hard to break out of the loop. I really do think astrology is a wonderful subject, and that if, certainly not in my lifetime, but maybe, decades or centuries ahead, it can, resume its place as a legitimate subject that contributes to the general understanding. At present, I think we're going through a period of de-evolution, so my hopes are a little, on pause right now.
Yeah. And somebody's made this suggestion about creating a think tank with citizen astrologers and research to help give astrology the authenticity that it needs.
That's an excellent idea. Mm-hmm. And people have tried it. It's going on. There are people that are trying to, create think tanks, and more of this needs to be done. Yes, it's an excellent idea. That's one way to do it. It's not too expensive. And you can have a group of people together and argue things out and come to some kind of consensus and then present their findings. Yeah.
Great. Another question here that is relating to financial astrology. And a question for you: other than reading Barbara Koval's book, Time and Money, would you suggest any other resources to help communicate the relevancy of financial astrology? Are there real-time world resources or materials that you're aware of to help those in the mainstream think differently?
Well, I think you can look at charts of stock market, S&P 500, charts of countries. You could develop on your own by following news events and these charts. And in the last few weeks, we've had a wonderful opportunity to see these things in play. There's some books that I've used, like Louise McWhirter wrote a book a long time, Astrology in the Stock Market, that has some ideas. It's a much older book. I think it's from about the 30s or something like that. Georgia Stathis, a friend of mine, is a lot more knowledgeable about financial astrology than I am. One little tidbit I would say people might want to look into is the business cycle. And it's basically the cycle of the nodes, but it's accepted in business. Back in the 19th century, there was some work on it. People made proposals about how this roughly 18 to 20 year cycle correlated with the rise and fall of real estate valuations. So that's something to look into. Financial astrology, I think that you need to know something about the markets. It could be the stock market, it could be commodities, and you need to really work it yourself in real time by studying events. You can read what other people have to say, and there are a number of books out there. But I think the general business cycle and the nodes, how when the nodes go into Aries, the equinox signs, there's a shift, and the node has gone into Pisces now, moved through Aries and Pisces, and now it's on the downswing. The general business cycle is on the downswing, and this will go on for about another 9 years or so. And then it'll begin to swing up. And there'll be interruptions in it. It's not consistent. But that's good to know. Just look into the business cycle. You can find it in non-astrology sources, and then you can find astrologers who recognize that, Yeah, the thing is really the nodal cycle.
Thank you. What are your views on medical astrology and the scientific evidence and research?
Well, that medical astrology is an excellent area for research on astrology, and I think it would start with you would want to start with an understanding of biological rhythms. That would be very helpful, and you need to get yourself data sets. If you wanted to study it as a research project, which I think would be the right way to do it. People have ideas about how to do medical astrology, but there's not a hell of a lot of research in it. There's tradition. Lee Lehman wrote a great book on medical astrology, going back to Hippocrates, and you could look at like Culpeper's herbal, and you get some ideas about how these things have been done. But we're in modern times now. We need better than that. We really need to test these things out and see what's working and what's not. And data sets are available. You just have to find them and break them down. That's the problem. Just, all research is based on data, and preparing data it's 90% of the work. The data sets are available, but you have to know what to do with them. You download them and you open them up on Excel, and then, they're a big mess, and you got to figure out what to do with them and how to straighten them out. And most data is collected not with a mind to doing astrology, because people in the rest of the culture do not think like astrologers do. They see things differently. They look at the picture and they don't see Waldo. They see everything else.
Right.
Yeah. Or they look at the picture and they didn't cross their eyes and see the magic pictures, the magic eye thing, right? So that's but medical astrology is a very good area for research. It's solid, it's useful, it's very valuable stuff. People want to know a lot about it, and it's an extension of natal astrology in a way. But yeah.
I'm going to take one more question here, or ask one more question that's been asked. And that is, could you explain what you mean that we're going through a period of de-evolution?
Yeah, I think that what's going on now is that left to its own devices, the political left just keeps progressing. It keeps trying out things and experimenting. And we have a trend now that's more to the right. It's all across the world that doesn't like that pace, doesn't like that forward pace, and it's a natural reaction to it. That's one thing that's going on, and I think that's just like a regular wave. You move forward, you move back, you move forward. Each time situations become refined and analyzed, and I think that's fine. That's just the way it should be. But by de-evolution, I think that there's a general simplifying and dumbing down that's taking place. That's the result of the media and the presentation of information. I think that people are not as knowledgeable as they used to be. I think tests have shown that people who read books are, score higher on intelligence tests than people who just look at the internet. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a collective dumbing down taking place. And it's inevitable with all the media that we have, and it's the ease of access. And also, I think the population pressures. We have a lot of people to deal with. And what happens is that you lose track of the bigger picture. We're losing, there are certainly plenty of people that realize that certain things are going on, that human beings are basically an infection on the planet. And, we need to use our highly developed brains to do something about that, to slow down and back off, and to realize that we're part of a much larger process. But that view is being rejected by a large number of people, or it doesn't sell. so it's not being promoted as much. And so, we continue to pollute, we continue to disturb the climate system. And I don't think it's getting better. So my conclusion is that it's a kind of de-evolution. Maybe that's not the best word for it, but it's certainly we're not maintaining the kind of standards of general intelligence that we need to in this time of crisis.
Great answer, Bruce. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We really appreciate everything that you've shared with us and all the knowledge that you've imparted to us. And
well, thank you.
Thank all of you for coming out today. We hope you enjoyed it. And as a reminder, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days for sure. So thank you, Bruce. And
you're welcome. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day.